One cold night, a desperate girl knocked on a stranger's door with a sick baby in her arms. She expected rejection. One cowboy stepped back and said, "Bring her in." From that moment, 6 lost children found more than shelter. They found family, courage, and a future no one could steal. The meaning of this story is clear. Kindness may look small, but in the right moment, it can change everything. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe.
The cold came up out of the ground that night, like it had a grudge. Eliza felt it through her boots first, then her knees, then everywhere. Bertie was a small furnace against her chest, and that scared her more than the cold did. A baby shouldn't burn like that, not for 3 days running. How far, Jonah said. Not a question. He'd stopped asking real questions around noon. There's a light, Eliza said. See it? There was. One yellow window, far out across the grass. The last house before the dark swallowed everything. They'd counted doors that week. Eliza had. Anyway, she'd stopped at 40. 40 doors, and every one of them shut. Some shut hard. The hard ones didn't bother her as much. It was the soft ones, the people who looked at 6 tired children and a sick baby and still closed the door. Gentle as you please. Like they were sorry, but not sorry enough. Those were the ones she'd remember. The store in town had been a soft one. The man behind the counter had looked at Jonah's face, and Maeve's, and little Tomas holding Bertie's hand. And he'd said he didn't extend credit to children of that kind. Polite, real polite. Then, the reverend on the church steps had said something about God's order, and how charity to the wrong sort only spread the rot. Eliza had wanted to spit. She hadn't. You learn not to. When you've got 5 people behind you, watching how you carry it. Keep walking, she said. We're almost there. They weren't. But it helped to say it. Wren walked beside her, silent as always. She hadn't made a sound in a year. Not since their mother. She just walked and watched and held things together in a way Eliza didn't have words for. The house got bigger as they came up on it. A barn, a fence, mended right. A pump. Somebody lived here who knew what he was doing. Eliza let herself hope for about 1 second, then put the hope away. Hope cost too much. She'd learned to spend it careful. She climbed the porch, steps alone, Bertie in her arms. The others waited at the gate. Benno, Tomas. She was so tired she was mixing up her own family's names. She knocked. Nothing. She knocked again. Harder. Please. I've got a sick baby. We've come a long way. Footsteps. Slow, not scared footsteps. The kind a man makes when he's not worried about who's on the other side. The door opened. He was big, not soft big the other kind. The kind that came from a life of lifting things heavier than himself. His face was burned brown by sun and weather. He had a beard that needed work and gray eyes that didn't give anything away. There was a rifle in his hand, not raised, just there, the way a man holds something he's used to holding. He looked at Eliza, then at the bundle in her arms, then past them both, out at the gate, at the 5 children standing in the near dark. He didn't say anything. Eliza had a speech ready. She'd built it walking, words to make him say yes. She opened her mouth to start it. Her name's Bertie, she said instead. Her voice came out rough. She's 6. She's had a fever 4 days, and it's getting worse. And I don't know what else to do. Every other door we found was shut. I'm asking you not to shut yours. The man looked at the baby a long moment. Bertie's lips had gone a little gray at the edges. Her breath came uneven. Catch and let go. Catch and let go. Something moved across his face. Eliza couldn't read it. It wasn't pity. It was older than pity, whatever it was. He stepped back from the door. "Bring her in," he said. "No questions. No, who are you? And where'd you come from? And what do you want? Just bring her in." She'd braced to beg. She didn't have to. She carried Bertie across the threshold, and the warmth of the room hit her like a wall, and she nearly went down right there. The man was already moving, down on one knee at the fireplace, building the fire up with hands that knew the work. He said over his shoulder, "You, what's your name?" "Eliza." "Eliza. Get the rest of them inside before the cold takes them too. There's a pump on the side. Buckets on the hook." He glanced back. "You know how to bring a fever down. Cold cloths. Keep water in her." Good. You know something," he stood. The fire was already catching. Still standing there. She didn't move. 3 weeks of shut doors had made her need to know. "Why are you doing this?" He looked at her. In the firelight, he seemed less hard. Still hard, just less. "Child sick," he said, like it was the only answer there was. A man doesn't need a reason to do the right thing. He just needs to not look away. Then he went back to the fire. Eliza brought the others in. They came the careful way children come when they've hoped too many times and gotten burned for it. Tomas first, holding the door. Then Jonah, counting the exits with his eyes. Maeve and Wren last, stopping in the doorway to take the measure of the place before she'd trust it. The man didn't ask them a single question. He just nodded at the bench by the fire. "Sit," he said. "You're cold, and you're hungry, and your sister needs help. That's enough for now." It was the first warm thing Eliza had felt in days, and it had nothing to do with the fire. She set Bertie down and started in with the cloths. Up on the mantel, half in shadow, sat a small pair of child's shoes, old ones covered in dust, like nobody had touched them in years, like nobody could. Eliza didn't ask about them. Outside the gate, out in the dark, where none of them could see, a man sat on a tall horse and watched the last child go inside. He watched the door close behind them. The warm light held in the window. "Well," Hollisvane said, soft to the rider beside him. "Looks like Ransom just dug his own grave." He turned his horse for town. The fever climbed with the dark. Eliza had seen it before, with their mother. The way a fever gathers itself in the small hours. Like it's been waiting all day for the house to go quiet so it can do its worst. She knew the pattern. She hated that she knew it. Bertie's skin went from hot to hotter. Her words turned to nonsense. Something about a bird. Something about a river. Eliza wrung the cloth out cold and laid it on her forehead and talked low the whole time. About nothing. About the horses she'd seen in the corral. About how maybe in the spring there'd be strawberries. Anything to keep the child tethered to the room. The man Ransom. The rider had called him. Though Eliza didn't know that yet came and went. He never sat down for long. He fed the fire. He brought a tin cup of broth and set it by her elbow without a word, then went back out. Once she heard him at the corral, talking soft to a horse. Then hooves, fast, going off into the dark. He came back and stamping snow off his boots. "Sent my man Gus for the doctor," he said. "And the school teacher. She knows nursing better than Doc does. Truth be told, if anybody'll come out this far on a night like this, it'll be her. Why wouldn't they come?" Ransom didn't answer right away. He crouched at the fire and added a log that didn't need adding. "Some folks in town have got opinions," he said finally, "about the kind of children I let in my door tonight." Eliza understood. She'd been understanding it for 3 weeks. She turned back to Bertie and didn't make him say more. Wren came and sat on the other side of the cot. She didn't do anything. She just took Bertie's small hand in both of hers and held it. She'd been doing that since they came in. Eliza had stopped telling her to rest. No point. Wren held on to people. That was her way of talking. Now that the other way was gone, the horse came back near midnight. The woman who came through the door was soaked to the bone and didn't seem to care. She shed her coat onto a chair, pushed her wet hair off her face, and crossed straight to the cot before anyone said a word. She put the back of her hand to Bertie's cheek, then her neck, then lifted the child's wrist and counted with her lips moving. "How long like this?" she said. "4 days," Eliza said. "Worse since sundown. And you've been cooling her." "Yes, ma'am." "Cloths, trying to get water in her." The woman looked up then, and Eliza got her first real look, younger than she'd expected. A face that had been pretty before it got tired. Eyes that didn't waste time. "Good girl," she said. "You've kept her alive doing the right things. Now let's keep it up and do them harder." She turned to Ransom. "I need that water colder. There's snow on the porch, and I need the room warm, but not close. Crack the window an inch." Ransom raised an eyebrow. "It's freezing out, and she's burning up. We meet in the middle." She was already rolling her sleeves. "Are you going to argue with me, Mr. Ransom? Or are you going to crack the window?" Something almost moved at the corner of his mouth. He cracked the window. Her name was Naomi Foster. Eliza learned it sometime in the next hour, between cloths, between the woman calling out for this and that, between the door opening once more to let in Doc Pryor, who came in looking like a man who'd argued with himself the whole way over and lost. "I shouldn't be out here," the doctor said, low hanging his hat. He said it to Ransom, not to the room. "You know what they'll say in town." Came out to the Ransom place at midnight to Dr. A. He stopped himself, glanced at the children, to Dr. Sick kids. "Then why'd you come?" Ransom said, not unkind. Pryor looked at Bertie on the cot, at Wren holding her hand, at the cold gray creeping at the child's lips. "Because I took an oath once," he said, "and the oath didn't have any exceptions in it." He set his bag down. "More's the pity for my reputation." Naomi didn't even look up. "Your reputation will keep. Doctor, the child won't." "Hands," he laughed, short and surprised, and got to work. The fever broke at 3 in the morning. Eliza felt it before anyone said it. The heat under her hand changed. Not gone, but breaking. The way ice breaks on a river. Bertie's chest started rising slower. Steadier, like whatever had been fighting inside her, had finally decided to rest instead of run. "She's turning," Naomi said quietly. "Yeah," Eliza's voice came out wrong. "Yeah, I think she is." She realized her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat on her knees to make them stop, and then she couldn't make the rest of her stop. She didn't cry loud. She just bent forward and put her forehead on the edge of the cot, and her shoulders shook, and she breathed ragged for about a minute. 3 weeks of holding it, all coming loose at once. Nobody told her to stop. Nobody touched her. They just let it happen, which was exactly the right thing. When she sat up and wiped her face, Naomi was watching her, not with pity, with something steadier. "You carried her how far?" Naomi said. 17 miles today. 40-some altogether." Naomi nodded slow. "I've known grown men who'd have set a sick child down somewhere along 40 miles and called it mercy." She handed Eliza the broth that had gone cold and untouched. "Drink. You're no good to her if you fall over." Doc Pryor packed his bag near dawn. At the door he paused and looked back at the room, the fire. The children asleep in a heap on the rug. The baby breathing easy now. "I'll come again if she needs it," he said. And I'll thank you both not to mention to anyone that I did. But he was almost smiling when he said it. Ransom walked him out. Naomi stayed. She sat in the chair by the fire, with the tiredness coming over her now that the work was done. And Eliza sat across from her. And, for a while, neither of them said anything. "You're the teacher," Eliza said finally. He said, "The school teacher." "I am. There's a school out here. There's a building. There's me. There's about 11 children whose parents will send them." Naomi looked into the fire. "And a good many more whose parents won't, on account of who'd be sitting beside them." She said it flat. No heat, just a fact she'd carried a while. "I think every child that can walk to a door has a right to learn what's on the other side of it. Letters, numbers, the world. Not everyone in this territory agrees with me on that." "Why not?" Naomi looked at her, at Jonah asleep with his arm over Tomas, at Maeve curled small, at Wren, who hadn't let go of Bertie's hand even in sleep. "Because it's easier to keep a person down," she said, "if you keep them from reading the deed to their own life." She let that sit. Remember that. A locked door and a closed book do the same work. Somebody'd rather you didn't know what's inside, either one. Eliza didn't fully understand it that night. She filed it away. The way you file something you're not ready to hold, but don't want to lose. Outside, the sky was going gray at the edge. The wind had quieted. Ransom came back in and stood a moment looking at the lot of them 5 children asleep. One breathing easy, the teacher and the eldest girl awake by the fire. "You should rest," he told Eliza. "I'll watch her." I know you can. You've been doing it 3 weeks. Let somebody else hold the weight a few hours." He pulled a chair to the cot and sat. "I've been up since yesterday morning, and I'll be up till tomorrow's. That's just how I'm built. Sleep." She looked at him. A big, tired man with no reason to lie to her and no reason to hurt them. A man who'd opened a door he had every right to keep shut. She lay down on the rug in front of the fire. She was asleep before she finished deciding to be. The last thing she heard was Naomi's voice, low, asking Ransom something, and Ransom's voice, lower, answering. She didn't catch the words, only the shape of them. 2 grown people sitting in a warm room past dawn, keeping watch so that 6 children didn't have to. She slept without dreaming about locked doors. It was the first time in longer than she could count. Bertie woke up asking for food and calling Ransom the Cowboy. "He's got a funny name," she announced to the room, sitting up on the cot with a tin bowl, eating like she hadn't eaten in a week, which was close to true. "Coal. Like the black rocks you burn." "Coal," Eliza said faintly. "That's what I said." Bertie went back to her bowl. Ransom Caleb, though to Bertie he'd be the cowboy for the rest of her life, didn't correct her. He just glanced at Eliza with something that wasn't quite a smile and went back to the stove. They stayed a day. Then 2. Bertie needed to get her strength back, was the reason Eliza gave herself. But on the morning of the 3rd day, she found Caleb at the workbench in the barn, mending a bridle, and she made herself say it. "We can't stay forever. Didn't say you had to, but we have been. And I don't." She crossed her arms, caught herself doing it, made herself stop. "We've got no family near. No money, the farm's gone. We've got nothing but each other." Caleb set the bridle down. He looked at her direct, the way she'd already learned he did. When he wanted to be sure, a thing got understood. "There's a bunkhouse on the north side," he said. "Hasn't been used in 2 years. Needs work. It's solid." She stared at him. "It's not charity." He said it before she could. "I need hands. Your boy Jonah's already worth 2 men around the horses, and he doesn't know it yet. You can run a house, I can see that. The little one with the questions can pass tools. Everybody works who can work. The pay is a roof and food, and a place nobody can shut you out of. He picked the bridle back up. That's the whole of the offer. Nothing fancier than that. Eliza stood there a long moment. The barn smelled like hay and horses and old wood smells that made her chest hurt for a farm she didn't have anymore. I need to think about it, she said. Take your time. She thought about it for 4 minutes, standing in the cold sun outside the barn. Then she went in and told the children they were staying. Nobody pretended to be surprised. The work started that day and didn't stop. Jonah took to the horses like he'd been born to them. Caleb showed him a thing once. Bluntly, no softening. And Jonah did it. And that was that. Tomas turned out to have an eye for ground where water would pool, where it wouldn't, which fence post was about to rot. Maeve attached herself to the kitchen and to Eliza. Bertie attached herself to Caleb. Simple as that. Following him to the pump and the barn and back. And Caleb let her, handing her small tasks and calling them important, which to Bertie they were, and Wren held things. That was still her job. She held the gate while Jonah led horses through. She held the basket while Eliza picked. She held on. Naomi came back on the 4th day with a crate. What's that? Caleb said, eyeing it. School. She set it on the kitchen table. Slates, a primer, chalk worn to nubs. These 6 are going to learn their letters. Mr. Ransom, since the town's not ready to have them sit in my building. She started laying things out. I'll come 3 days a week. After chores. It won't cost you anything but the loan of your barn for an hour. Caleb frowned. Letters won't get a body through a winter. Naomi straightened up and looked at him. No, she said, but not knowing them is how a man like Hollis Vane takes a winter from you anyway, with a paper you can't read and a smile you trust. She let it hang. You want to give these children something nobody can ever take. Don't give them money. Money walks off. Give them the ability to read every word somebody puts in front of them and know whether it's the truth. She tapped the primer. Letters are freedom. That's not a pretty saying. That's the plainest fact I know. Caleb looked at her a long moment. Then he went out to the barn. Eliza thought he was leaving. She heard him moving boards around, sawing. An hour later, he came back in carrying a board he'd planed smooth and painted black with something out of a can, a frame nailed around the edge. He leaned it against the barn wall without a word. A chalkboard. The man who didn't believe in letters had built the thing letters get written on, with his own 2 hands. Naomi looked at it. She looked at him. She didn't say anything either. But something passed between the 2 of them that Eliza saw and decided not to mention. The first lesson was a disaster and wonderful. Tomas drew a horse instead of his letters. Bertie ate a piece of chalk and had to be told not to. Jonah didn't want to try in front of the others. Sat back with his arms crossed, until Naomi handed him the deed-shaped feeling of his own name on the slate, and his whole face changed when he got it right. Maeve went last. She wrote her letters careful, tongue between her teeth. Then, under her name in English, she wrote it again in a different shape. Strange letters. Old ones. What's that? Eliza asked. Maeve said, the Irish. My da wrote my name like this. She looked up, half waiting to be told to wipe it off. People had told her things like that before. Speak American. You're not over there anymore. Caleb was passing through. He stopped. He looked at the 2 names on the slate, the English and the Irish, side by side. Leave it, he said. Both of them. That's who she is. And he kept walking. Maeve didn't wipe it off. They'd been there 2 weeks when Hollis Vane rode up to the gate. He came alone, which was its own kind of message. A big man on a bigger horse, in a coat that cost more than the whole bunkhouse. with a smile fixed on like a man who'd practiced it. He didn't get down. "Ransom," he said. "Heard you took in some strays." "Children," Caleb said. He'd come out to the fence, and he stayed on his side of it. "They've got names, if you want them." "I'm sure they do." Vane's eyes went over the place. The mended fence, the garden, the children stopping their work to watch. "I'll be plain. Neighbor, since you're a plain man, I've been wanting this parcel a long while. The water, especially. You sit on the best water for 10 miles, and you run. What, 40 head? It's a waste." The smile again. "I'll pay you well. More than well. Enough you could go anywhere. Take your strays somewhere. They'd be more welcome. Not for sale. Everything's for sale. Friend, it's only a question of the number." Vane gathered his reins. "Water has a way of getting complicated. Out here, rights get questioned. A man finds his claim isn't as clean as he thought." He looked down at Caleb, pleasant as Sunday. "Be ashamed for all these children to get settled, and then have the ground go out from under them." Again. It was the again that did it. The man knew where they'd come from. He'd looked into them. Caleb didn't move. "You're done talking now," he said. "Quiet. Gates behind you." Vane tipped his hat like he'd been paid a kindness, and rode off. That night, Eliza found Caleb on the porch in the cold, looking out at nothing. "He can't really take the water," she said. "Can he?" Caleb was quiet a while. "Men like that don't take things with their hands," he said. "They take them with paper, with words you don't know how to read, and a court that's friendlier to a coat like his than a coat like mine." He looked at her. "You understand now why I built that woman her chalkboard." Eliza thought about Naomi's voice. "A locked door and a closed book do the same work." "Yes," she said. "I think I do." Inside, through the window, the lamp was lit, and Maeve was teaching Bertie to write her own name. The two of them bent over a slate, the Irish letters and the English ones, and nobody telling them which one they were allowed to be. The rain came in October and stayed. Not a storm, just a gray, patient rain that soaked everything and made the work twice as hard. Fence wire went slick. The horses got sullen. Caleb spent 3 days stringing a new line along the south pasture. And on the third day, Naomi came to teach and found him out there in it. Hat dripping, hands raw, swearing low at a post that wouldn't set. She didn't go inside. She came out to the fence. "You'll catch your death," she said. "The post will keep till the rain stops." Rain's not going to stop. He drove the bar down again. The post moved the wrong way. He said a word he wouldn't have said in front of the children. Naomi laughed. He looked up at her, surprised, and she put a hand over her mouth like she was sorry. But her eyes weren't. "Forgive me," she said. "It's only you fight that post like it insulted your mother." And after a second, Caleb laughed too. A short, rusty sound, like a door that hadn't opened in a while. "Hold this," he said. She held it. He said it. Between the two of them, the post went in straight, and they stood back in the rain and looked at it, both soaked through, and there was a moment there. Just a moment. Eliza saw it from the kitchen window and pretended she hadn't. After, Naomi made him come in and dry by the fire, and she put coffee on like it was her own kitchen, and Caleb let her, which Eliza found more interesting than anything. He didn't let anybody do anything in his kitchen. That was the start of it. The clashing first, then the softening. It went on like that for a couple of weeks, Naomi coming 3 days, staying for supper more often than not, arguing with Caleb about everything, from how to roast a chicken to whether Jonah was ready for the green colt. They argued like two people who enjoyed it. The children noticed. Bertie started calling Naomi the teacher lady with a particular fondness, and following her around the way she followed Caleb. so that some afternoons the woman had a 6-year-old shadow at each elbow. The town noticed, too. Eliza heard it first at the store. She'd ridden in with Caleb for flour and nails, and while he loaded the wagon, she went in for the order. And the storekeeper's wife, a broad woman named Mrs. Tate, who delivered every piece of gossip, like she felt terrible about it, leaned over the counter. "People are talking, honey," she said, about out at the ransom place. "About what?" "A man his age, children, and that teacher out there at all hours." Mrs. Tate tilted her head. "And you're getting to be a young woman, aren't you? It doesn't look right." Eliza had learned a trick from watching Caleb. A flat, quiet voice landed harder than a loud one. "He's the man who kept my sister from dying," she said. "If someone in this town has a better offer for 6 orphans, I'd love to hear it." She set her money down. "If not, I'll take my change." Mrs. Tate's mouth opened and closed. It got worse before it got better. The next Sunday, Reverend Pruitt preached on it, not by name. He didn't have to. He talked about the natural order, and how charity to the wrong sort only bred more of the wrong sort, and how a Christian household didn't mix bloods and tongues under one roof like animals in a pen. Half the town nodded along. But Reverend Doyle was there too, the old preacher, from the little church on the East Road, the one most folks thought was past his prime. And when Pruitt finished, Doyle stood up in his pew, uninvited, and said his piece in a voice that filled the room. "I've read that same book front to back for 40 years, he said, "and I never once found the verse where the Lord asked a hungry child what language it prayed in before he fed it." He picked up his hat. "Mercy's the whole job. Brothers, there isn't a smaller version of it that still counts." And he walked out. It didn't change everyone's mind, but it gave the ones who'd been quiet something to hold on to. After that, a few folks started nodding at Eliza in the street. Just a few. It was something. The day the store wouldn't serve Jonah, Naomi was there. Eliza had sent him in for thread, a small errand, the kind you don't think twice about. But the new clerk took one look at Jonah and Maeve waiting at the counter and said the store didn't serve their kind without an adult. And not always then. Jonah didn't argue. He'd learned not to. He just took Maeve's hand and turned to go. His face shut tight the way Eliza hated to see it. Naomi stepped in front of them. She walked the 2 children right back up to the counter. She laid coins down, one at a time, clicking each one against the wood. "Thread," she said. "Whatever color the boy wants. He's choosing it, not me." The clerk looked at her. "Ma'am, I don't think. You don't have to think. You have to sell thread. That's the entire occupation." She didn't raise her voice. She just stood there, and the longer she stood, the worse it got for him, because 2 other customers had stopped to watch. These are children of this county, same as any. They eat the same bread, and they catch the same fevers, and they'll be buried in the same ground. You will sell the boy his thread. The clerk sold the boy his thread. And what Eliza remembered after what she'd remember for years wasn't Naomi's words. It was Caleb. He'd come in behind them, somewhere in the middle of it, and he never said a thing. He just stood himself in the doorway, big and quiet, so that when they all turned to leave, there he was, at their backs. And nobody in that store thought about saying another word. That was a kind of protecting that didn't need a sound. The thing about Naomi came out by accident. It was a wet evening, the children long abed, and Eliza had come back to the main house for a forgotten shawl. The door to the small room off the kitchen was open a crack. Naomi was in there. She didn't hear Eliza. She was sitting on the edge of the cot with something in her hands. A little square of cloth, embroidered. Eliza could just see it. A name worked into it in careful stitches. Thomas Foster. And underneath, 2 dates. Close together. Too close. A few months apart. Naomi was holding it to her chest and crying without any sound at all. The way you cry when you've done it so many times, your body's learned to do it quiet. Eliza stepped back. She didn't take the shawl. She went out into the rain and stood under the eave a minute, her own chest tight, and then she walked back to the bunkhouse. She didn't tell anyone, but she understood something now. She understood why Naomi loved these children so fierce and held herself back from them all at once. Why, some nights at supper, the woman would look at Bertie laughing and have to look away. Why, she said, every child has a right like it was a wound and a creed both. Naomi had had a child, and she'd lost him, and she was terrified, right down to the bone, of loving 6 more and losing them too. Eliza was 15, but she'd buried 2 parents in a month, and grief had taught her things faster than years could. She knew you could want a thing so badly, you ran from it. She'd watched Caleb do it too, in his own way, keeping everyone an arm's length back, building walls out of work. 2 grown people, both of them afraid of the exact same thing. She lay awake a long time that night, listening to her sisters breathe, thinking that the most dangerous moment for a person wasn't when they were starving at a closed door. It was the moment after the door opened, when they finally had something to lose again. The autumn fair came the first Saturday in November, and for the first time, the whole family went into town together. It was Naomi's doing. You can't hide them on a ranch forever, she'd told Caleb. The town has to get used to seeing them as children, not as a rumor. Children. So they loaded the wagon, all 8 of them, and rode into Mercy under a sky scrubbed clean by the last of the rain. It was a good day, for a while. There were pies and a fiddler and a pen of prize hogs that Tomas studied like scripture. Bertie won a ribbon for being the smallest child to ride the old pony around the ring, and wore it the rest of the day, pinned crooked to her coat. Maeve traded a girl her age 2 buttons for a hair ribbon, and came back delighted. Even Wren smiled. Eliza saw it, watching the fiddler's bow saw away. He stayed close at first. Then he started to relax. He drifted over to where some boys his age were pitching horseshoes, and he watched. And after a bit, one of them waved him in, and he played a round, and he was good at it. And for about 20 minutes, he was just a 13-year-old boy at a fair. Then Delvane showed up, Hollis Vane's son, 16, big for it, with his father's coat in miniature and his father's way of looking at people like they were something he'd stepped in. He watched Jonah sink a ringer, and he said, loud enough to carry, that he didn't play games with stable hands. And then he said a word, the one that lands like a slap. The other boys went quiet. Jonah set the horseshoe down. Careful, Eliza, watching from across the green, saw his shoulders go up around his ears, saw his hands close. She started walking fast, but Caleb got there first. He didn't grab Jonah. He stepped in beside him, close, and he put one hand flat on the boy's chest, not holding him back, just resting there, steadying. He looked at Delvane. You'll want to walk away, son, Caleb said. Mild as you please. Or what, old man? Or nothing. There's no or. Caleb's voice didn't change. You'll just have to live being the kind of man who says that to a boy half a head shorter than him. That's punishment enough. Walk away. Delvane looked like he wanted to swing. He looked at the size of Caleb. He walked away. He said something over his shoulder about telling his father, and Caleb let him say it. Then Caleb turned to Jonah, who was shaking, fists still tight. You wanted to hit him, Caleb said. Not a question. Yeah, I know. I wanted to let you. Caleb crouched down a little, to be eye to eye, which Eliza had never seen him do for anyone but Bertie. Listen to me, because it's important, and I'll only say it once. That boy wants you to swing. You swing, and you prove every ugly thing he just said. He goes home the same as he came, and you go home in the sheriff's wagon. That's the trade he's offering, and it's a robbery. He gripped Jonah's shoulder. A fist proves him right about you. Standing there and not swinging that proves him wrong. And it costs you more. I know it costs you more. That's how you know it's worth it. Jonah's fists came open slow. It's not fair, he said. No, Caleb agreed. It's not. Most of it isn't. But you don't get to choose whether the world's fair. You only get to choose who you're going to be inside of it. He stood, and you. You're going to be a man who didn't swing. Today. Anyway, come on, there's pie. It wasn't a clean victory. Jonah was quiet the rest of the afternoon, and Eliza knew the word would sit in him a long time, the way those words do. And that night Tomas, who'd seen the whole thing, pressed something into Jonah's hand, a little horse. He'd whittled himself. Weeks of work. The only thing of value the boy owned. He didn't say anything about it. He just gave it. Jonah kept it. The dance was after dark, under lanterns strung between two poles. Eliza didn't see how it started. One minute Naomi was helping clear the pie tables, and the next the fiddler struck up something slow. And Caleb, who didn't dance, who Eliza would have bet money had never danced in his life, walked over and held out his hand. Naomi looked at it. The whole town was watching, or might as well have been. Eliza saw Mrs. Tate's head swivel. She saw Reverend Pruitt's mouth pinch. Naomi took his hand. They weren't good at it. That was the thing Eliza loved. Caleb counted under his breath, and Naomi laughed at him for it and stepped on his foot, and he didn't seem to mind. They turned slow under the lanterns. Two people who'd both decided, finally, to risk something, in the half-dark, at the edge of the light. Caleb leaned down, and Naomi went up, and they kissed. Quick, plain, the kind of kiss that isn't for show. Eliza turned away to give them the moment. She found herself smiling so hard. Her face hurt. She was still smiling when she noticed Hollis Vane. He was standing by the livery, in the dark, watching the dance the way a man watches a card game he intends to win. Dell was beside him, talking fast, gesturing back toward where Jonah stood. Vane listened. He didn't look angry. That was the frightening part. He looked pleased, like his boy had handed him exactly the thing he'd been waiting for. He caught Eliza watching. He touched the brim of his hat to her, polite as church, and smiled. The papers came 4 days later. A rider brought them out from the county seat, a thick envelope, official seals, the whole performance of it. Caleb read it at the kitchen table by lamplight, his face going still in the way Eliza had learned to dread. What is it? She said. Vane. Caleb set it down. He's filed with the land commissioner. 2 things. He pressed 2 fingers flat on the table. 1 for each. He's questioning my water rights. Says my claim to the upstream parcel isn't clean. Wants a territorial hearing to settle it. And the other thing. Caleb was quiet a moment. He's questioning whether I'm a fit man to be keeping children at all. No wife, a single man living rough with, he stopped. He's using the fight at the fair. Dell's version of it. Says my household's a danger. Says the children ought to be placed somewhere proper. The room went cold around Eliza. He can't, she said. He can't just, they're not his. They're not mine either. Not on paper. Caleb looked at her. And for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something flicker behind the steadiness. Not fear, exactly. That's the trouble with paper. Eliza, it doesn't care who fed you or who sat up with you through a fever. It cares what's written down. And right now, what's written down says, I'm a stranger, and he's a respectable man with means. Eliza thought about Naomi's voice in the firelight. Weeks back, a locked door and a closed book do the same work. She thought about the chalkboard Caleb had built, the Irish letters next to the English. Letters are freedom. Then we learn what's on the paper, she said. All of it. Every word. Caleb looked at her a long moment. And then, slow, he almost smiled. Yeah, he said. We do. He folded the envelope and put it in his breast pocket, over his heart, like a thing he meant to carry into a fight. We surely do. Outside, somewhere across the dark grass, a coyote called once and went quiet. Inside, the lamp held steady. And in the bunkhouse, Eliza could hear it faint Maeve, sounding out words from the primer to Bertie, slow and careful. The two of them reading in the dark, because nobody was going to take that from them. Not without a fight. The lessons changed after the papers came. Before, Naomi had taught letters because letters were good to know. Now she taught them like she was arming a fort, every afternoon, after chores. The children sat in the barn at the table Caleb had built, and Naomi put real things in front of them, not the primer, a bill of sale she'd borrowed, a page from the county record, a deed. This is how a man lies to you in writing, she said one gray afternoon, smoothing a paper flat. He buries the lie in long words and hopes you'll be too proud to admit you can't read them. So you nod, you sign, and later you find out you signed away something you didn't mean to. She looked around at them. The cure for that isn't pride. It's reading. Slow, every word. You don't understand a word. You stop and you ask, and you don't move on till you do. There's no shame in stopping. The shame's all on the man who wrote it crooked. Eliza read everything twice. Jonah read slower, but he read stubborn, his finger under each word. Even Tomas, who'd rather have been with the horses, learned to spot the difference between a date and a dollar amount. It was Jonah who changed everything. They were going over the word claim, name. Naomi had written it on the board and was explaining what it meant, how a man could put his name to a piece of ground, and the government would write it down, and then the ground was his, by law, and no one could take it. Jonah went very still. Say that again, he said. Naomi said it again. Jonah got up. He walked out to the bunkhouse without a word, and came back carrying his bundle, the one he'd had since the night they came, the one nobody had ever asked him to open. He set it on the table and untied it. Inside were the few things a boy carries when everything else is gone. A spoon, a button, a folded square of oilcloth, much handled. He unfolded the oilcloth. Inside was a paper. My pa said, keep this, Jonah said. His voice was strange. He said, if anybody ever asks about the land, you show them this and only this. He made me say it back to him. Show them this and only this. He looked up. I never knew what it said. I can't. I couldn't read it. Naomi took it like it might come apart in her hands. Her face changed as she read. She read it again. Then she set it down very gently on the table and pressed her fingers to her mouth. Jonah, she said, do you know what this is? No, ma'am. It's a homestead claim, a legal one, filed and stamped. Her voice was shaking now, just a little. Your father claimed 160 acres of land. Good land. Water land. He proved it up, built on it. Worked it 5 years. The way the law requires, and the government granted it to him, free and clear. This says so. This is the patent. She looked up at the boy. Your father owned that ground. Jonah owned it the way no one can argue. It's the strongest paper there is. Then where is it? Eliza asked. The land. Where's our pa's 160 acres? Naomi didn't answer right away. She was looking at the description on the deed, the section, the range, the careful surveyor's words. I need to see a map, she said. Caleb had a map, a county plat, rolled up in the barn. They spread it on the table and weighted the corners. And Naomi found the section numbers from the deed and put her finger on it. The land was upstream, the water parcel. The land Hollis Vane had filed against Caleb to claim. Nobody said anything for a moment. Eliza felt it settle over the room cold. It's the same ground, she said. Jonah's pa's land. It's the same ground Vane wants from you. It's better than that, Naomi said, and there was something hard in her voice now. Something Eliza hadn't heard. Or worse, Vane's been telling everyone that ground is his. He's filed papers swearing it's been his for years. But it can't be. Because this she touched Jonah's deed says it belonged to a free man named Ezekiel Carter, legally on record. And a patent like this doesn't just evaporate. Somebody would have had to make it disappear. Caleb had gone very still by the window. The Carter place, he said slowly. Up the North Fork, there was a family up there. Free folks. Had a little farm. He looked at Jonah. 3, 4 years back. House burned in the night. They said it was a lamp. Jonah's face had gone gray. It wasn't a lamp, he said. The room held its breath. I was 7, Jonah said. He was looking at the table, at the deed, at his father's name on it that he couldn't read, but now knew. Men came in the night. My pa wouldn't sell. They'd been after him to sell, and he wouldn't. He kept saying the land was ours. It was legal. Nobody could make us. His voice cracked. They set the house. My ma got me out the back. She told me, run and don't look back and keep the paper. So I ran. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. I kept the paper. I just couldn't read it. All this time, I had it and I couldn't even read my own pay's name on it. Eliza put her arm around him. He let her, which he almost never did. It was Naomi who said the thing out loud. The thing the whole title of their lives had been hiding. They didn't burn you out and run you off because nobody wanted you, she said quietly. Listen to me, Jonah. That's the lie the world tells children like you, that you're astray, that nobody wanted you, that you should be grateful any scrap. It's a lie. She tapped the deed. Somebody wanted that land so badly they killed for it. You weren't unwanted. You were in the way. There's a world of difference. And you're old enough now to know which one is true. Jonah looked up at her. My pa was a landowner, he said, testing the words. Your father was a free man and a lawful landowner, Naomi said. And no fire and no lie and no rich man with a fine coat gets to write over that. It's still true. It's true, right now, on this table. She slid the deed toward him. Read me his name. You can do it, now. Jonah looked down. His finger found the line. Slow, the way she'd taught him. Every letter. Ezekiel Carter. He said it again. Stronger, Ezekiel Carter. It was the first time in his life he'd read his father's name. Eliza watched something straighten in him as he did it. Some bent thing coming upright. Caleb crossed to the table. He looked at the deed a long time. Then he rolled it back into its oilcloth. Careful as you'd handle something living. This goes in the bank vault tomorrow, he said, behind a lock, with witnesses to say it was whole when it went in. He looked at Jonah. I'm going to draw up papers of my own. If anything ever happens to me, anything, this ground goes to you, to all of you. In writing, the strongest paper there is. He almost smiled, tired. Your teacher's right about one thing. From here on, We fight this with letters. That night, Eliza couldn't sleep. She lay listening to the wind and thinking about all of it, the fire, the deed, the word unwanted, and how Naomi had taken it apart. And in the dark, soft, she heard a sound she hadn't heard in a year. It was Wren, lying in the next bed, where she thought no one could hear. Her lips were moving. She was mouthing words from the day's lesson claim. Free, land, name, practicing them silent in the dark. Not out loud, not yet, but moving. Eliza closed her eyes and let herself believe, for the first time, that some broken things could mend. Hollis Vane didn't come with his lawyer the next time. He came with the truth, which was worse. It was the second week of December. Hard cold, the kind that cracks. Caleb had ridden into Mercy to wire the territorial office about the hearing, and he came back wrong. Eliza saw it the moment the wagon cleared the gate. He sat the bench too stiff. He put the horses up too slow. He came inside and ate his supper and said almost nothing. And when Bertie climbed into his lap, he held her like she might break, or like he might. Eliza waited till the children were down. Then she came back to the main house and found him at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold and not drunk. What happened in town? She said. Caleb didn't look up. Vane stood up in the middle of the mercantile, he said, in front of a dozen people, and told them something about me. Something that's true. He turned the cold cup in his hands. I'd rather you heard it from me than from Mrs. Tate's version. So sit down. She sat. You know I lost my wife, he said, Sarah, and a baby boy. Just born. 6 winters back. You know that much. Yes, but you don't know what nobody knew but me. I thought is how. He set the cup down. There was a storm coming. A bad one. I had cattle out at the North Range that didn't belong to me. I was minding them for hire that winter. Money was tight, and Sarah was near her time, and a man takes the work he can get. His jaw worked. The cattle belonged to Hollis Vane. Eliza felt the cold come into the room. The storm came faster than they said it would. I had a choice that night. His voice was flat now. Scraped down to nothing. Ride home. 2 hours. And ride out the storm with my wife. Or go bring Vane's cattle before the snow buried them. If I lost his herd, I lost the contract. And the contract was the winter. Food, the doctor for the birth. Everything. He stopped. I went for the cattle, he said. I told myself it was for her, for the baby coming. I told myself I'd be quick. I wasn't quick. The storm closed in, and I couldn't get back. And I spent the night in a line shack, keeping another man's beef alive. He looked at his hands. When I got home, the next afternoon, the fire had gone out. She'd gone into labor alone. There was no one. The baby came too early and too hard, and by the time he didn't finish it. He didn't have to. They both died in that cold house, he said, while I was 2 valleys over, saving Hollis Vane's cattle. I chose his livestock over my own blood. That's the truth Vane told the mercantile today, and every word of it is mine. The kitchen was so quiet. Eliza could hear the fire. You didn't know, she said. You couldn't have known. The storm would. Doesn't matter what I knew. Matters what I chose. He pushed back from the table and stood and went to the window, his back to her. I built this place after. Worked it alone. Didn't let a soul close because a man who'd do that, a man who'd leave his wife in the cold for money, that man's got no business being trusted with anything that breathes. His voice dropped. And then 6 children walked up my road, and I let myself forget what I was. For a little while I let myself. He shook his head. Vane did me a favor today, he reminded me. Eliza stood up. That's not Caleb. That's not what this is. You didn't leave us. You took us in. And what happens the next time? There's a storm and a choice. He turned around, and his face was terrible. You want to bet 6 children on me making the right one. I already made it once. I made it wrong. He shook his head again. Slower. You should write to your uncle, whoever you've got. There's people would take you, now that the baby's well. Decent people. People who didn't already prove what they are. We don't want decent people. We want you. You don't know what you want. You're 15. It was the cruelest thing he'd said. And he said it to push her away. And she knew it. And it worked anyway. She felt it land. She turned and walked out into the cold without her coat. The next days were the worst since the road. Caleb pulled back into himself like a hand into a fist. He still did the work, fed the stock, mended what broke, but he did it silent. Early, gone before the children woke. He stopped coming in for supper. He stopped letting Bertie ride his hip. When she held her arms up to him in the yard, he'd crouch and say something gentle and set her down and walk on. And Bertie didn't understand. And that was the part that broke Eliza's heart cleanest. Naomi came, and the lessons went hollow. She knew something was wrong. Eliza couldn't tell her all of it. It wasn't hers to tell, but Naomi was no fool. And there was something pulling Naomi back, too. Eliza saw some old fear waking up, the man and the woman, both backing away from the same fire. Like the thing they wanted most had turned dangerous. One evening, Eliza found Naomi at the gate, ready to ride home early, her face wet. It's not your trouble, Eliza said. Whatever he said. It's an old thing. I know, Naomi looked out at the dark ranch. I know about old things. She wiped her face. I lost a child once. Eliza, a little boy. I've been afraid of every child I've loved since. Afraid the loving's just a way of handing the world more to take. She laughed, but it wasn't a laugh. Your Caleb and I are a fine pair. 2 people who'd rather feel nothing than risk feeling it twice. She gathered her reins. Tell Bertie I'll bring the new slates Thursday. She rode off. Maeve ran the next night. Eliza found the bed empty at midnight. The blanket folded. The way a child does when she means it kindly. When she's trying not to be a bother, even as she leaves. There was a scrap of slate on the pillow, with 3 words scratched on it. The letters careful. I to much trouble. I'm too much trouble. Eliza screamed for the house. It was Caleb who found her. Of course it was. He took the gray gelding into the dark with a lantern and Jonah riding behind, and they tracked her by the small prints in the snow, 1.5 miles toward the river road, where the cold could have taken her by morning. He came back into the lantern light with Maeve wrapped in his own coat, shaking but alive, her face buried in his shoulder. He carried her in and set her by the fire and knelt down in front of her. The whole household crowded the doorway. You listen to me, he said, and his voice cracked right down the middle. You are not too much trouble. Not you, not any of you. He took the slate, the one with the 3 sad words, and he held it up. Whoever taught you to think you're trouble for needing a home, they're the ones in the wrong. Not you, never you. His hand was shaking. You don't fold up your blanket and walk into the cold to make things easier for anybody. You stay. You stay and you let people carry you. That's not weakness. That's what a family's for. Maeve was crying. So was Eliza. So she saw was Naomi, who'd come back when she heard the shouting and stood now in the doorway with her hand over her mouth. And Caleb pulled the little girl in against his chest and held her, the way he'd been refusing to hold any of them for a week. And over her head, his eyes found Naomi's across the room. And something passed between them that wasn't backing away anymore. He'd spent a week trying to prove he couldn't be trusted to choose right when it mattered, and the second it mattered. He'd ridden into the dark and chosen a child. He didn't have the words for what that meant. Eliza could see he didn't, but she had them, lying awake later, with Maeve safe and breathing beside her. A man isn't the worst thing he ever did. He's the thing he keeps choosing, over and over, after, and Caleb Ransom kept choosing them. The hearing was set for the week before Christmas. Vane didn't mean to let it get there. Eliza pieced that together later. At the time, it was just a smell smoke. Wrong, on a wind that had no business carrying it. It was late afternoon, 3 days before they were to ride to the county seat. The cold had broken into one of those dry spells the prairie gets, even in winter. When the grass goes brittle and the wind comes up out of the southwest, with nothing to stop it for 100 miles. Tomas smelled it first. He'd come in from the south fence, and he stood in the yard with his nose up like one of the dogs. "Something's burning," he said. Then they all saw it, a line of it, low on the horizon, a dirty orange seam between the grass and the sky. And it was coming, fast. The wind shoved it toward the ranch like a hand sweeping crumbs off a table. Caleb came out of the barn at a run. "Grass fire," he said, and his voice had a thing in it Eliza had never heard, not fear exactly, but the cousin of it, the thing that makes a man move. "Wind's driving it right at us." Eliza, count heads. Now, she counted. Her stomach dropped. "Tomas. Where's Tomas there?" "Jonah. Birdie." Then her eyes went around the yard twice. "Maeve. Where's Maeve?" "She went to the south draw," Jonah said. "After the lesson. She likes the little creek down there. She said she'd be back by." He stopped. The south draw was downwind. The south draw was right in the path of it. "I'll get her," Caleb said. He was already throwing a saddle on the gray. "I'm coming," Jonah said. "You're not. She's my sister." Jonah was already up on the second horse. Bareback. No argument in him at all. Just a fact. And Caleb looked at him 1 second and made a decision. "Stay on my flank. You don't ride into anything. I don't ride into first." Eliza swung up. "Get the others to the creek behind the house. Wet blankets. Wet everything." Gus came around the barn at a hobble. Old knees and all. "The dam," Caleb said. "Flood the south ditch. It's the only fire break we've got." He wheeled the horse. "Open it all the way." "Gus, I don't care if we lose the whole pond. Water's no good to anybody if we're ashes." And he was gone. Jonah behind him. 2 riders flat out into a wall of smoke. What happened in the south draw? Eliza only knew from after. From Jonah, who told it once and never again. They found Maeve where the draw narrowed. The fire already in the grass on both sides of her. A child standing in a shrinking island of green with the heat coming on. She'd frozen. That's what fire does to you. It takes your legs. Caleb rode straight through a curtain of flame to reach her, and his coat caught, and he beat it out against the horse's neck. And he leaned down and hauled her up across the saddle and turned to ride back the way they'd come, and the way they'd come was gone. Fire had closed it. There was one gap, the south ditch, the one Gus was flooding. Caleb rode for it. He couldn't see if the water had come yet. He rode for it on faith. A child against his chest and a boy on his flank, and the fire on all sides. And when they came over the lip of the ditch, there was water in it. Gus had got the gate open. The pond was emptying itself into the cut, a thin brown ribbon of it. Just enough, and the fire reached the wet ground and faltered. Just faltered. Long enough. They came through. They came up out of the smoke black-faced and singed. The horses wild-eyed. Maeve coughing but alive. and Eliza, standing at the house creek with a wet blanket in her hands and her heart in her throat, watched them appear out of the gray like something delivered back from the dead. But the fire wasn't done. The wind still drove it at the buildings. The ditch had bought minutes, not safety, and then the town came. Eliza never forgot the sight of it. Down the river road, wagons, a dozen of them, more men standing in the beds, barrels of water lashed and sloshing, shovels and wet sacks, and the whole of Mercy that had spent 2 months whispering about the ransom place, coming now at a dead run to save it. Somebody had seen the smoke from town and rung the church bell, and Reverend Doyle had got the first wagon moving. And after it come the way people do when the thing in front of them is bigger than the thing they'd been arguing about. They fought it together. That was the part Eliza held on to after. Men who wouldn't sell Jonah thread stood shoulder to shoulder with Caleb in the smoke and beat the fire with wet sacks. Mrs. Tate, who'd told Eliza it didn't look right, was the first one off the first wagon, hauling a bucket with her sleeves shoved up, shouting orders like a general. The whole bucket line ran from the creek to the fire and back. Town hands and ranch hands and children's hands, all in the same chain. And nobody in that line stopped to ask who was standing next to them. They turned it at the barn, saved the house, the barn, the bunkhouse, lost the south pasture, and a stretch of fence and one shed. By full dark it was out, and the yard was full of soot-blackened people sitting wherever their legs gave out, passing a dipper around, too tired to talk. Caleb walked down the bucket line when it was over. He stopped in front of Mrs. Tate. She was filthy, her good dress ruined, and she looked at him like she didn't quite know what to say for once in her life. "Thank you," Caleb said. "Don't," she waved a sooty hand. "Don't make a thing of it." Anybody, she stopped, looked around at all of them. The children, the saved house. "I've said some things," she said, "about you, about them. She couldn't get to the word." So instead she crouched down in front of Maeve, who was wrapped in a blanket by the creek, and she tucked a stray bit of hair behind the girl's ear. Gentle, the way you do with your own. "You're all right now, lamb," she said. "You're all right." It wasn't an apology. It was better than one. It was a person changing her mind with her hands. Later, much later, when the town had gone and the children were asleep, Eliza found Caleb at the edge of the burned pasture, looking out at the black ground, still smoking faint in the moonlight. "You rode through fire for her," she said. "Yeah, you said you couldn't be trusted to choose right." She came and stood beside him. "When it mattered, a week ago." She looked up at him. "It mattered today. And you chose her. You didn't even stop to think." Caleb was quiet a long while. "No," he said finally. "I didn't stop to think." He let out a breath that shook. "I've been telling myself 6 years that I'm the man who left his family in the cold. Turns out that's just the story I got stuck in." He looked at his hands. Blistered, raw. A man isn't the one thing. He's the choosing. Over and over. He almost laughed. "Took a wall of fire to teach me what you figured out at 15. Across the yard, in the doorway, Naomi stood watching them. She'd come back when she heard the bell, and she'd worked the bucket line all night with the rest, and she hadn't left. She wasn't backing away anymore either." Eliza could see it from there. The courthouse at the county seat was the biggest building that had ever been inside. Brick, a room with 40 seats and a rail and a raised bench. And on the morning of the hearing, every seat was full, because in a small county, a thing like this was the best show going. Hollis Vane sat at his table in a new coat with his lawyer beside him, and a stack of papers squared off in front of him like a fortress. He looked calm. He looked like a man who'd already won and was only waiting for the formalities. Caleb's side had Mr. Whitmore, the lawyer from Caldwell, a thin, unhurried man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. And it had Naomi. And it had 6 children scrubbed and braided and dressed in their best, sitting in the front row with their backs straight because Eliza had told them, on the wagon in, that today they were going to win this with their letters, and they were not going to be afraid. Was a tired-looking man named Harmon, who'd heard 1,000 land disputes and expected this to be the 1,001st. Vane's lawyer went first. He was good. He talked about Vane's years in the county, his standing, his improvements to the land. He laid down paper after paper, a bill of sale, a filing, a notarized claim, all of it showing the upstream water parcel belonged to Hollis Vane and had for years. He talked about Caleb, too, a single man, rough living, 6 orphan children of mixed blood crowded into a bunkhouse. A household so unstable a child had nearly burned to death in a grass fire not 3 days past. Was this, he asked the room, a fit place for children? Or were they better served, placed with respectable means? Eliza felt the room tilt against them. She felt the eyes. Then Whitmore stood, and he was quiet where the other man had been smooth. Mr. Vane has shown us a great deal of paper, he said. I'd like to look at it. Slowly, the commissioner will forgive me. I read slow. I was taught that there's no shame in stopping on a word till you understand it. The shame's on the man who wrote it crooked. Eliza's breath caught. It was Naomi's line, word for word, and she understood. Then that the lesson and the law had been the same thing all along. Whitmore had Vane's central document brought to the table. The filing that swore the water parcel had been Vane's since 1869, and he called Eliza to read it aloud to the room. She hadn't known he would. Her legs went watery, but she stood, and she walked to the table, and she put her finger under the first word the way she'd been taught, and she read. Slow, every word. The whole room silent. She read the date of filing, 1869. Then Whitmore had Jonah come up, and Jonah unfolded the oilcloth, and he read slow, stubborn his finger under each letter, his voice shaking, but clear his father's homestead patent. He read the section and the range, the same ground, and he read the date the land was granted, free and clear, to Ezekiel Carter, 1871. The room didn't get it at first. Then it did. A patent granted by the government in 1871 to a free man named Carter, on land Vane swore had been his own since 1869. They couldn't both be true. The government does not grant land it has already sold. One of those papers was a lie. A patent like the boy's doesn't appear from nowhere, Whitmore said into the silence. The government grants it after 5 years of proving up, with surveys, with witnesses, with a record in Washington. It is the strongest title there is, which means Mr. Vane's 1869 claim cannot exist unless he turned a page. Mild as milk unless somebody added it to the county book after the fact, after a certain house burned down, after the only man who'd contest it was dead, and his children scattered where nobody would think to ask them what paper they carried. Vane's lawyer was on his feet shouting objection. Vane himself had gone still in a different way now, a cornered way. And then Mrs. Tate stood up in the gallery. I'll say what I saw, she said, loud, her chin up. I keep the store. The land clerk. Hell, he drinks at the back of my husband's place. 3 years back. Around the time of the Carter fire, Hollis Vane bought him drinks for a week, and I saw money pass. And after, Pell told my husband he'd fixed a book for Mr. Vane and laughed about it. She folded her hands. I held my tongue 3 years because it wasn't my business, and Vane's a man you don't cross. I'm done holding it. That's the truth, and I'll swear to it. The room came apart in noise. Harmon hammered for quiet. Eliza, in the front row, felt the whole thing turn, felt the floor that had tilted against them tilt the other way. Hard, it was over, but for the saying. Harmon would order the county book examined, the forged claim struck, the patent restored to the heir of Ezekiel Carter, which was Jonah. The water parcel had never been Vane's to fight over, and a man who'd forged a land record, and likely worse than that, had no standing to question anyone's fitness to raise anyone. But before Harmon could say the words, something else happened. Vane, undone, turned in his chair, toward the children, toward Jonah, with his face working, and he opened his mouth to say something. Eliza never knew what, because a small voice cut across the whole room first. Don't you look at him. The room went dead silent. It was Wren who hadn't said a word in a year and more. Wren, standing up in the front row, shaking head to foot, her hands in fists, looking straight at Hollis Vane. You don't get to look at him, she said. Her voice was rusty and small, and it carried to every corner of that still room. Those were your men. At the fire. The first fire. I was at the window at our old place. The night the Carters burned. I saw the riders go by toward the North Fork, and I saw them come back, and one of them was, she pointed. Her whole arm trembling was him. I saw, and I couldn't say. I couldn't say anything. For so long I couldn't say anything. Tears were running down her face. I can say it now. Eliza was on her feet. So was Naomi. So was Caleb. Halfway down the rail. But it was Bertie who got there first, Bertie, 6 years old, who didn't understand the law or the land or any of it, who only knew her sister was talking, her sister who never talked. And she ran to Wren and threw both arms around her waist and held on. And Wren put her hand on Bertie's head and looked at Caleb across the room and said the second sentence she'd said in a year. Can we go home now? Pa. Caleb crossed that courtroom in about 4 steps. He went down on his knees and gathered both girls in. And Eliza saw his shoulders go, saw the big man finally let it out, right there in front of the whole county. And nobody laughed. Even Harmon at the bench took his glasses off and looked at his papers a while. When it was quiet enough, Caleb stood. He kept one hand on Wren's shoulder, like he didn't trust her not to vanish. And he looked at Naomi across the rail, and he didn't wait for a better moment, because he'd learned about better moments, how they don't come. I've been a broken man 6 years. His voice wasn't steady, and he didn't try to make it. These 6 put me back together without asking my leave. I'd be obliged, he stopped. Started again, Naomi. I want to put the rest of my life together with you, if you'll have a singed, stubborn, hard-headed man, and the 6 best reasons in the territory to say no. The whole courtroom heard it. Eliza supposed he meant them to. Naomi came through the gate in the rail and took his face in both her hands. You forget, she said. I lost a child too. I've spent years afraid to love anything I might lose. She was crying and laughing at once. I'm done being afraid in good company. Yes, you hard-headed man. Yes. They were married in the spring, when the burned pasture had come back greener than the rest, the way burned ground does. Reverend Doyle did it, in the little church on the East Road. And the place was full, not because everyone in Mercy had become good overnight, but because enough of them had learned that they could be better than they'd been. and wanted to stand in a room and prove it. Mrs. Tate cried in the second row and pretended it was the dust. Doc Pryor came and didn't once mention his reputation. Even some who'd nodded along to Pruitt's sermons came, hats in hands, a little ashamed and a little glad, which is how most changes of heart actually look. The children stood up front, all six, with the surname Ransom now, signed and stamped and filed the strongest paper there is. Eliza had stood beside Caleb at the county office the week before and watched him write their names in the book, one after another. And she'd thought about all the papers that had been used against them, the forged claim, the questions about their fitness, the cold official words. And here was a paper that did the opposite. A paper that took 6 strays the world had called unwanted and wrote them down as belonging. After the wedding, there was a supper at the ranch, long tables in the yard, the whole community, food enough for an army. Jonah had the framed homestead patent hung now in the bunkhouse, his father's land restored to him, his to grow into. He told Caleb he wanted to work it someday. The North Fork. Build it back. Caleb had said the land would wait for him, and that he'd help. And that was that, in the slow gold end of the afternoon. Naomi gathered the children, and a good many of the town's children, too, who'd started coming around now, and she told them she'd be opening Mercy's first real school in the fall. A public one, for every child who could walk to the door. Every one, she said. She looked around the circle of small faces, brown and pale, freckled and dark, the whole stitched together, lot of them. I'll say to you what I've said since the first night I came out to this ranch. No child is born unwanted. Not one of you. The world forgets it, sometimes forgets it on purpose, even when remembering would cost somebody money or pride. Your job, when you're grown, is to remember it out loud, and to open the door, always the door. She smiled. That's the whole lesson. The rest is just letters. Eliza, 15 and a half now, and bound for the teaching herself, would carry that the rest of her life. She thought about it that evening, after the town had gone, sitting on the porch step, while the family settled toward dark behind her. She thought about a road in Kansas. No, it had been Wyoming, but the cold was the same everywhere, and 40 closed doors, and a baby going gray in her arms, and the last light bleeding out across the grass. She thought about how she hadn't believed, that night, that anyone would open. She'd knocked at Caleb's door without real hope. She'd learned by then what hope cost, and she'd been rationing it careful. The door had opened, not because the world was fair. She knew better than that. The world wasn't fair, and good things didn't always come in time. She'd buried 2 parents who'd have told you the same, but a door had opened. One man in one doorway, on one cold night, had decided to step forward instead of back, and 6 lives had turned on it completely. That was the thing she'd carry. Not that everything works out, it doesn't. The smaller, harder, truer thing, that one person deciding to show up when they had every reason not to, could be the entire difference. Not heroic, not grand, just the plain choice to open rather than close. She meant to spend her life being, for somebody, what Caleb had been for them. Not a ranch in Wyoming, maybe. Not a fever night, just the open door, whatever shape it took. She figured she owed the world that. She figured she might even be up to it. Behind her, the kitchen door creaked. It had creaked for a year, and nobody had fixed it, because it had become one of those sounds you'd miss if it stopped. Caleb came out and sat on the step beside her, a little to her left, not crowding. He'd added another chair to the supper table that week, when she'd asked him why, with the family already complete. He'd shrugged and said, "You never knew when somebody might come up the road needing a place. Leave a chair. Leave a door open. It costs nothing, and it might be everything. Wren said 3 whole sentences at supper. He said, "Now." I heard. She corrected Tomas on his arithmetic. She was right, too. Caleb almost smiled. He looked out at the prairie going blue and then dark. The new grass moving in the wind. The burned ground healed over. Somewhere in the bunkhouse, Bertie was laughing at something. Maeve was reading out loud, slow and careful. Her 2 names, the English and the Irish, written that morning on a fresh slate, side by side, the way they'd always be. It wasn't a perfect life. The grief for her parents hadn't gone. Eliza had learned it didn't go. It just changed shape. Became a thing you carried, instead of a thing that carried you. There were hard days still. There'd be more, all of them, around a table that didn't quite fit, in a house that was never quiet, in a family nobody had planned, and everybody had built out of the only materials they'd had. Crisis and kindness, stubbornness and time, and the plain, world-changing decision, made once in a doorway and 1,000 times since, to open rather than close. The lamp was lit. The doors stood open behind them, letting out the light. Nobody fixed the creak. It was just the sound the door made, and they were all of them home. This fictional story may include themes of romance, betrayal, violence, hardship, or emotional distress that could be sensitive for some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised, as the purpose of these scenes is to create dramatic tension and emotional depth within the narrative world.
And so, as the lamp burns in the ransom house and the open door lets its light spill out across the dark prairie, this story leaves us with something far greater than the ending of a Western tale. It leaves us with a truth as old as the frontier itself. A single act of mercy can become the beginning of an entire new life. Eliza and the children did not come to Caleb Ransom's door with power, money, family name, or promise of reward. They came cold, hungry, frightened, and nearly out of hope, carrying a sick child through a world that had already closed 40 doors in their faces. And yet, when Caleb opened his door, he did more than save Birdie from a fever. He interrupted the cruel story the world had been writing over those children, the story that said they were unwanted, unworthy, too much trouble, the wrong kind, the kind of people decent folks could turn away and still sleep at night. Caleb's choice reminds us that goodness does not always arrive with grand speeches or heroic declarations. Sometimes it sounds as simple as, "Bring her in." Sometimes it is a fire built higher, a cot pulled closer, a bowl of broth placed beside a tired girl, and a man deciding that a child in need is reason enough. That is one of the deepest values this story gives its audience. Mercy does not need permission. Compassion does not ask whether someone is convenient, respectable, profitable, or familiar. It simply sees suffering and refuses to look away. But this story is not only about being rescued. It is about what happens after the door opens. Eliza, Jonah, Maeve, Wren, Tomas, and Birdie do not merely survive because someone gives them shelter. They begin to stand because Caleb, Naomi, and eventually the town give them room to become more than their wounds. Naomi's lessons teach us that letters are not just marks on a slate. They are weapons against lies, keys to locked doors, and proof that a person's name, history, and rights cannot be stolen so easily when they can read the paper placed before them. Jonah's deed, hidden for years in oilcloth, becomes more than a legal document. It becomes the return of his father's name, the restoration of a stolen truth. And the moment a boy learns he was never astray, he was the son of Ezekiel Carter, a lawful landowner, and no rich man's lie could erase that. Ren's voice carries the same meaning. For a year, grief and terror had sealed her words away, but when the moment came, she spoke small, shaking, and strong enough to change the whole room. Her voice reminds us that healing may be slow, but silence is not the same as defeat. Some truths wait inside people until they are finally safe enough to be spoken. Caleb's journey gives the story another powerful lesson. A man is not only the worst thing he has done. Caleb has lived for years inside the guilt of one terrible choice, believing he forfeited the right to love, protect, or belong. But the children show him, again and again, that character is not proven in one old failure. It is proven in the choices a person keeps making afterward. He opens the door. He builds the chalkboard. He stands behind Jonah. He rides into fire for Maeve. He signs the papers that make 6 lost children his own. In doing so, he learns that redemption is not a word spoken in church or written in a court record. Redemption is built by hand, day after day, choice after choice, until the old story no longer has the strength to hold you. And the town of Mercy teaches us something just as important. People do not become good all at once. They change awkwardly, imperfectly, sometimes with shame on their faces and soot on their hands. But when the grass fire comes, the same town that once whispered, judged, and closed its doors comes running with wagons, buckets, and wet sacks. That does not erase the harm they did, but it shows that communities, like people, can choose better than they have chosen before. This story asks every viewer a simple question. When someone comes to your door cold, afraid, and carrying more sorrow than they can bear, will you open or close? The answer may seem small in the moment. One door, one chair, one lesson, one hand at someone else's back. But lives turn on such things. Families are made from them. Futures are restored because someone decided that mercy was the whole job, not a smaller version of it. That is the heart of this story. A home is not made by blood alone, nor by perfect people, nor by papers in a courthouse, though sometimes those papers matter dearly. A home is made when people choose one another through fear, hardship, grief, and fire. It is made when a child learns to write her name in every language that belongs to her. It is made when a broken man leaves one more chair at the table because he understands that another traveler may come up the road. And it is made when the door remains open, letting out the light, so that the next lost soul can see there is still somewhere in this hard world where they may be welcomed in.